On a February evening in 1928, 23-year-old medical student Theora Hicks looked out from the passenger seat of her date's car and watched downtown Columbus, Ohio pass by. Theora was pale and pretty with cropped brown hair. She had on a fitted dress and wore her father's old watch on her wrist. She was wearing a dress that night to go out, but Theora often wore pants, dress shirts, and ties, a fashion trend that some women had embraced in the 1920s to show that certain types of clothes were not just for men. Theora's date turned his car onto a rural road that led out of the city, and Theora watched the buildings of Columbus give way to open fields and farmland. She turned to her date and smiled, and he smiled back. Theora's date that night was a man named Marion Myers. He was significantly older than Theora, almost 35 years old at the time, and he was tall, skinny, and bald. Theora and Marion had met on campus at Ohio State University. Theora went to medical school there, and Marion worked in the university's agricultural department. They had been seeing each other off and on for over a year, but only Theora's closest friends even knew Marion existed, because Theora did not talk much about her personal life. Her best friends knew that Theora occasionally went on dates with Marion, but they thought she never took any of those dates too seriously. And unlike most of her friends, Theora never talked about wanting to meet the right guy or getting married. In fact, some of Theora's friends had started to wonder if she even liked men at all, and they thought maybe seeing Marion was just a way for her to cover up the fact that she was actually interested in women. But her friends could never be sure, because when Theora talked to them about her life, she almost always focused on her dream of becoming a doctor or on the social changes she wanted to fight for that would give women more rights in a society that was still heavily dominated by men. Her friends loved that Theora was passionate about important subjects, but most of them still thought the way she lived her life was kind of strange. Even the fact that Theora was going to medical school seemed totally out of the ordinary to them, because in the late 1920s, women made up less than 5% of all medical students in the United States. In the car, Marion asked Theora how school was going, and she smiled again. One of the reasons she liked spending time with Marion was that he believed she had as much right to be in medical school and to become a doctor as any man did. Theora said school was going well, and that she was really busy with classes and work, but she didn't mind. Theora had worked hard in school her entire life, and she continued to work hard at medical school to achieve her goal of becoming a doctor. And so far, her commitment had paid off. While in school, Theora had spent time working in the veterinary department at Ohio State, alongside one of the most respected veterinarians in the country, Dr. James Snook, who invented a revolutionary technique for spaying cats and dogs. And soon, Theora was going to start working at the campus hospital. Theora believed that any work experience in a medical facility would help her in the future when she was looking for a job, and she thought that having connections like Dr. Snook would lend her credibility in a profession that a lot of people thought women had no business pursuing. Marion pulled his car onto a dirt road that was almost hidden by the fields that surrounded them on both sides. The road was bumpy, and the car shook a little. Theora laughed as she got tossed back and forth in the passenger seat, and then she saw their destination ahead of them. They were going to a shooting range kind of in the middle of nowhere, a few miles outside of Columbus. The place was popular with amateur marksmen and hunters in the area, but Theora and Marion were not going there to shoot guns. The location of the shooting range, and the fact that it blocked the view of people driving by on the main road, had made the open field near the range a popular spot for couples to go to have sex. The range had become so well known for this that people in Columbus had nicknamed it Shirt Tail Alley. Marion drove his car past the shooting range and a little way into the open field and parked. Theora leaned across the seat and kissed him, and then Theora slipped off her dress, Marion took off his clothes, and they climbed into the cramped back seat together. But just a few minutes later, they heard someone pounding on the car door. Theora and Marion froze. Then they heard a policeman telling them both to get out of the car. Theora looked at Marion, and she almost started laughing. She reached into the front seat, and she grabbed her dress. Outside, the policeman stepped away from the car, turned his back, and allowed Theora and Marion to step outside and put their clothes back on. Then, after they were dressed, the officer issued them both a ticket for the crime of fornication which was defined at the time as sexual intercourse between two unmarried people. And the officer told them they would each have to pay a $20 fine, which would have been over $350 in 2023. The policeman told Marion and Theora to go home, and then he got into his car and waited for them to leave. Theora and Marion climbed back into Marion's car, and right away Marion apologized for putting Theora in that situation. Theora said she wasn't angry, and she wasn't ashamed or embarrassed. She believed part of achieving greater rights for women was getting rid of the judgment and ridicule that young women her age often endured when they had sex before they were married. But Theora was not naive. She knew that a lot of people still frowned on things like premarital sex, so much that it was technically against the law where she lived. And even though Theora did not agree with that law, she didn't want more incidents like the one she had just had to adversely affect her future. Theora knew the odds were stacked against her when it came to having a successful career as a doctor, so she didn't want to make her dream any harder to achieve than it already was, and she didn't want to give anybody an excuse not to take her seriously at med school. So, in the months after she got caught with Marion, Theora talked even less about her personal life with her friends, and her friends noticed that Theora didn't go on dates at all anymore. Even when Theora went to parties with her friends and their boyfriends, she never brought a guy with her. But Theora's friends didn't worry about her because she seemed happy, and she seemed even more focused on medical school and her future. And by the beginning of 1929, a few months after Theora turned 24, she felt like her dream of becoming a doctor was actually within her reach. Her classes were still going well, she was training for a new position at the hospital on the Ohio State campus, and there was a chance that she was going to get to help Dr. James Snook, the respected veterinarian she had worked with, on a book he was writing. And so, even a lot of Theora's friends and family, who had wondered why she had gone to medical school in the first place, started to believe that Theora was close to achieving her dreams. At about 7 p.m. on June 13th, 1929, over a year after the fornication incident at the shooting range, Theora stood in her small bedroom in her apartment in Columbus, Ohio. She was reading a letter, and she felt her heart beat a little faster. The letter started off, "My dearie, I awakened early at about 7 and of course thought of you at once." Theora read about how much the person who had written the letter couldn't wait to see her again, and Theora smiled at the writer's signature at the bottom of the page. In big letters, it just said, Janet. Theora put the letter from Janet back into one of the drawers in her desk, and she got even more excited about her plans that night. Then Theora looked in the mirror to check her makeup and clothes. She was wearing a sleeveless brown dress with a white collar and a rhinestone belt, and she had her father's old watch on her wrist like she always did. Theora grabbed her purse, stepped out of her bedroom, and saw her two roommates sitting in the living room of their apartment. The two young women saw Theora, and a look of shock came across both their faces. They couldn't remember the last time Theora had gotten dressed up to go out on a date, but they were sure that's what she was doing. Theora told them she was going out with somebody that night, but she didn't say who. Then she told her roommates she would see them when she got home, and she went outside. She walked down to the end of the street and hailed a cab to take her to the Ohio State campus. On the drive, Theora asked the cab driver if she could have one of their cigarettes because Theora was nervous and she thought maybe it would calm her down. The driver reached into his pocket, pulled out a pack, and handed her a cigarette and matches. Theora lit the cigarette, but only took 2 puffs before she put it out, and she still felt nervous and excited. When Theora got to Ohio State, the sun was just setting, and she thought the campus looked like it was glowing. She walked down a tree-lined sidewalk towards the parking lot by the student center, and she saw a blue Model A Ford Coupe parked in the lot. That was Janet's car. Theora looked around to make sure nobody was watching her, and then she walked quickly to the blue coupe, she hopped into the passenger seat, leaned over, and gave Janet a kiss. And soon after, the car pulled out of the parking lot and headed out of Columbus. At 10:30 a.m. on Thursday, June 14th, so the morning after Theora had met Janet on campus, 2 teenage boys stepped out of a car and walked through the high grass in an open field near the shooting range outside of Columbus. The boys both loved shooting rifles at the range, and that morning they had decided to have a contest to see who was the better shot. As they walked through the field, the boys laughed and talked, and each of them boasted about how they were going to win the competition, but then one of the boys stopped and stared a few feet ahead of them into the field. His friend stopped behind him too and asked what was going on. The boy pointed his finger to where a swarm of flies were buzzing around something on the ground that was hidden by the tall grass. Both of the boys squinted to get a better look, and they wondered if maybe there was a dead animal that was attracting all the flies. So they walked a bit closer, the sound of the flies getting louder and louder as they approached. Then the boys both stopped again because they thought they saw a pile of women's clothes on the ground. The boys looked at each other and laughed. They knew the reason couples came to this field by the shooting range, so they figured, maybe a woman who was here with her date had been forced to run off without her clothes because the cops had shown up. But the boys were quickly more interested in the swarm of flies and whatever was below them, and so they took a few more steps forward, and when they got close enough to actually see what was on the ground, they both started screaming for help. Pretty soon, the farmer who owned the land and who had been working nearby ran over to the boys. The farmer looked down at the ground where all the flies were swarming, and he told the boys to go get the police. The boys turned around and ran back through the field to their car. They got in and drove a few minutes down the main road to the small local police station. They ran inside and told the first cop they saw what they had found in the field. 2 police officers ran out of the station, got into their car, and drove to the field where the boys had just come from. About an hour later, Detective Otto Phillips of the Columbus Police sat at his desk going over some notes on a case he was working. Phillips's phone rang, and he answered it. A police officer from a small department outside of the city was on the line. He told Phillips that a body had been discovered in a field near the shooting range, and the local police needed help. Phillips hung up the phone and put away his notes from the other case. He figured that case wasn't nearly as important as a dead body that was just found in a field. Phillips stood up, put on his jacket, grabbed his fedora hat, and headed out of the station. He drove a few miles outside of Columbus and saw several cars parked on the side of the road next to the open field by the shooting range. Phillips got out of his car and walked towards the small group of men that had already gathered in the field. Phillips saw there were 2 cops from the nearby station, the county coroner, and a police photographer. Phillips knew the coroner well, but he introduced himself to the others and then asked if they would all clear some space for him. All the men moved back, and Phillips took a few steps forward. And right away, the sound of the flies buzzing and the smell hit him first, and then when he crouched down, he saw the body of a young woman. Phillips took off his hat and tried to swat the flies away. Then he leaned in closer to the body. The victim was lying on her left side, and her face was on the ground. Her right arm was stretched out in front of her, and it was very badly bruised. Phillips knew this shooting range was like a lover's lane for young couples. So his first thought was that this crime scene could be the horrible result of an argument that this poor girl had had with her boyfriend. Phillips stood up and called the coroner and the other officers back over. The other officers said they had not located a weapon of any kind in the area, and they also said they had not yet found any identification of any kind on or near the victim. The coroner pointed out to Phillips that the victim's watch had stopped at 9:58. He thought that was probably close to the time that she had been killed the night before. The victim's head, face, and neck were covered in blood, and so the coroner said he would run some blood tests when they did the autopsy. But in police investigations in 1929, blood tests were basically only used to determine 2 things: if the blood belonged to a human or an animal, and what the blood type was if it was found to be human blood. But a lot of people share the same blood type, so Phillips knew a blood test could not identify a specific person. So as Phillips stood there in the middle of the field, he had no idea who he was looking at, and the test the coroner was going to run would not make that any clearer. But Phillips had to figure out who this young woman was before he could even start thinking about who might have killed her. The news of the body found outside the city did not take long to spread. And that afternoon, 2 of Columbus's newspapers ran salacious headlines about the dead girl found at the infamous Lover's Lane, nicknamed Shirt Tail Alley. Normally, Detective Phillips hated those kinds of headlines, and he couldn't stand that newspapers often put wild theories in their articles before anything was even known about a case. But that afternoon, Phillips thought the attention-grabbing newspaper stories might actually help him figure out who the murder victim was. And Phillips would be right. Not long after the newspapers went out that day, 2 young women arrived at the Columbus police station. They said they had seen the articles about the body found in the field, and they were worried it was their roommate, because she had gone out the night before, but never came home. Phillips thanked the women for coming in. Then he asked them if they would go with him and another officer to the mortuary where the body had been taken to see if they could identify the victim, and the women agreed to go. So the women took a short drive with Phillips and the other police officer. Then they walked into a cold, quiet room in the mortuary. The officers led them to a table to see the body, and the women stood there in shock. They hugged each other and started crying. The victim's face was mangled and bloody, but they could still see it was their roommate, Theora Hicks. Phillips said he was sorry to put the women on the spot when he knew how upset they were, but based on where police had found Theora's body, his instinct was that whoever had killed her was most likely a man she was seeing. So Phillips asked if they knew who that man might be. The women talked to each other for a second, and then one of them told Phillips that they knew Theora had gone out on a date the night before, but that she was very private about her personal life and almost never talked about who she was actually seeing. But the woman said there was one guy who Theora had always seemed to go back to in the past, and that was an older man named Marion Myers. Phillips thanked the women again for all their help, and then he and the other officer took them back to the station. Later that night, Phillips began looking into Marion's background, and it didn't take long for him to think this guy was the perfect suspect. Phillips learned from the officers at the small department outside of Columbus that a year earlier, Marion had paid a fine after he had been busted for fornication. Phillips also learned that Theora had been in the car with Marion when police found him, and that the incident had taken place in the same field where the teenage boys had discovered Theora's body. Early the next morning, so June 15th, the county coroner was sitting in a small office at the mortuary putting together notes from Theora's autopsy. Then he heard footsteps outside the office. The coroner put down his pen, got up from his desk, and walked out of his office. And he got startled when he saw a tall, skinny, bald man pacing back and forth. The coroner asked why the man was there, and the man looked at the coroner and said he wanted information about the dead girl police had found at the shooting range. The coroner asked who the man was and why he thought it was okay for him to be there, but the man just kept pacing and asking about the dead girl. So the coroner just turned and rushed back into his office and called the Columbus police to tell them what was going on. But by the time the coroner hung up and walked back out of the office, the tall, skinny, bald man had already disappeared. But when the coroner described this man to the police, they were certain it was Marion. And Detective Phillips was already planning to bring Marion into the station that day. Not long after the call from the coroner, Phillips sent officers to the house where Marion lived on the Ohio State campus to get him and bring him in for questioning. The police found Marion at the house and quickly drove him to the station. Marion was already Phillips's prime suspect, and his bizarre behavior at the mortuary just made him seem even guiltier to Phillips. Phillips led Marion into a small interrogation room. It was a cool day, and it had been raining, but Marion looked hot and sweaty. Phillips asked Marion about his relationship with Theora. Marion said they had dated on and off for a couple of years, but they were not dating anymore. Marion said he loved Theora, but she did not love him. And he was sure that she was seeing someone else even when they were together. Phillips asked Marion where he had been on the night of Theora's murder. Marion said he had nothing to do with what happened to Theora. Then he proceeded to stumble through a story about everything he had done on the day of the murder to prove that he had an alibi. Phillips felt like during his time as a detective, he'd learned how to read people pretty well, but there was something about Marion that he just couldn't quite figure out. Marion came off as a jealous, jilted lover, and there was a chance that he was making up his supposed alibi on the spot. But Phillips also got the sense that this was the kind of guy who would go into a panic and start rambling, even when he was asked a simple question, like what he had eaten for dinner the night before. So by the end of the interview, Phillips still considered Marion a major suspect, but he wanted to know if Marion was right about Theora seeing someone else. Because if Theora was dating someone else, and that was who she had gone out with the night she got murdered, Phillips needed to find out. Later that morning, Phillips and other members of the investigative team went to Theora's apartment, and her roommates showed them to her bedroom. At first glance, Phillips thought it looked like the typical bedroom of a young single woman. But when he opened one of the drawers of a small wooden desk, Phillips started to think there might not be anything typical about Theora at all. In the desk drawer, Phillips found a Derringer, a small handgun that was easy to conceal. Next to the gun, Phillips found a couple of bank passbooks, which were savings account logs that people kept in the 1920s, and when Phillips looked at those passbooks, he was stunned. Theora had at least 2 savings accounts with almost $2,500 between them. For reference, at the time, that was more than the average American family made in a year. Also, $2,500 then would have been equal to about $45,000 today in 2023. Phillips had talked to Theora's roommates and a few of her other friends after her body had been identified, and they had all said that Theora worked on campus just to make enough money to get by at medical school. So Phillips was surprised that she had thousands of dollars in savings, and he started to wonder if Theora had been living some kind of a double life. Then Phillips opened another desk drawer, and he found something that immediately backed up that double life theory. Phillips pulled out a stack of letters that had been written to Theora, and they were all from someone named Janet. And once Phillips had read through the letters, it seemed clear to him that Theora and Janet had been in a very serious romantic relationship. So Phillips needed to find out if Janet was the person Theora had gone out with on the night of her murder. But Phillips didn't have a last name for Janet, and when he asked Theora's roommates about Janet, they said they had no idea who Janet was. A few hours later, Phillips and his team met with Theora's classmates and people who she worked with at the campus hospital. But nobody they talked to knew anyone named Janet. And so the police went down their list of other people to talk to, and they saw there was a guy named Dr. James Snook who Theora had worked with in the veterinary department. And so they contacted James and they asked him if he'd be willing to come to the police station and answer some questions about Theora. And James said fine. He came down to the station, and he sat down with Phillips and the other members of the investigative team. Phillips immediately thought James looked and talked exactly like a typical professor. He was 49 years old, he wore a nice suit and glasses, and whenever he talked, it sounded like he was explaining things to a big group of college kids. James told the police that Theora had once worked in the veterinary department in the steno pool, which meant she took notes and shorthand in meetings and at lectures. And James said Theora had been great at her job, and so he thought she might be able to help him while he compiled stories for a book he wanted to write. Phillips asked what the book was about, and James got a little embarrassed and said he was working on a book about himself. Because not only had he been a pioneer in veterinary science and medicine, but also he'd won a gold medal at the 1920 Olympics in Belgium. Once that information came out, immediately the officers started asking James questions about what it was like to compete in the Olympic Games and what it felt like to win gold against amazing athletes from all around the world. But eventually, Phillips got the conversation back on track, and he asked if James knew of anyone named Janet who worked in his department at the university or who might be connected to the veterinary school in some way. James thought about it for a minute, but said nobody came to mind. But he admitted that after being a professor for years, he was not great about remembering all the names of all of his students. They kind of blended together. And then at the end of the interview, Phillips thanked James for coming in and said they'd follow up with him if they needed to. After that interview, Phillips was getting frustrated. He had figured that Janet, the person who wrote the love letters to Theora, had to be a classmate or coworker, or at least somebody Theora knew from school. But so far, the search for Janet had been a total dead end. and the team was still looking into Marion's alibi, so they couldn't rule him out as a suspect. They even decided to bring Marion back in and to keep him at the station until they were sure they knew where he had been on the night of the murder. But Phillips was having doubts that Marion was the killer, and he was almost positive that Theora's secret lover, Janet, had something to do with Theora's death. Later that day, Phillips met with the coroner at the mortuary, and the results of Theora's autopsy threw Phillips for a loop. At the time of her death, Theora had traces of marijuana in her system, but it wasn't from smoking marijuana, which would be the most common way to ingest the drug. Instead, Theora had ingested a very uncommon type of marijuana in powder form. In addition to that, Theora had also ingested something even stranger: Blister Beetle extract, more commonly called Spanish fly, which was a chemical substance taken from an insect. At the time, some people believed Spanish fly was an aphrodisiac that heightened a person's sexual performance, but Spanish fly was not exactly easy for anyone to just get. So by that evening, Phillips was starting to feel like this case that had seemed pretty straightforward at the beginning was just getting weirder and weirder and weirder. So, by that evening, Phillips was starting to feel like this case, which had seemed pretty straightforward at first, was now starting to seem really complicated and just totally weird. And then, later that night, the case got even weirder, because Phillips got a phone call from a woman who said she was a landlord, and that she was sure she had rented a small apartment in the city to the dead girl she'd seen in the newspaper. Phillips hung up the phone with the landlord and just shook his head. In the course of about a day, he discovered Theora's gun, her shocking bank accounts, her love letters, and her secret apartment. But he still didn't have the one piece of evidence he badly wanted. He didn't know who this Janet person was. On the same night that Phillips had spoken to that landlord, he and a few other officers drove across town to see the apartment Theora had supposedly rented. Phillips was exhausted, and he felt like that day might never end, but he hoped maybe something in this new apartment would either prove Marion was the murderer or lead him to Janet. The landlord walked Phillips and his team into the small one-room apartment. A large brass bed took up most of the space, and there was one wooden chair in the corner. Phillips also saw a back door that would allow people to come in and out of the apartment without being seen by anybody on the street in front. One look at the place, and Phillips knew this was a classic love nest where people would meet to have a secret affair. Phillips showed the landlord a photo of Theora, and the landlord said that was definitely the woman who had rented this place, but she'd used a different name. The landlord also said Theora had told her she would not be renting the apartment anymore and would move her things out that week. Phillips and his team searched the room for any piece of evidence that might help their investigation, but it looked like Theora had already moved out, because all they found was a woman's brown hat lying on the hardwood floor. So when Phillips's long day finally ended, he still had Marion in custody at the police station, but he didn't really have anything new to go on. In the days following Detective Phillips's visit to Theora's secret apartment, police were able to corroborate almost all of Marion's alibi for the night of Theora's murder. But there was still about 30 minutes that night that Marion could not account for, and nobody close to him had seen him during that time. 30 minutes was long enough for Marion to have driven Theora out to the field by the shooting range and to have killed her, so Marion remained a prime suspect. Then, even though the investigation into this case had only been going on for a few days, the county prosecutor started to put a lot of pressure on Phillips and his team. The county prosecutor was new, he was young, and so the police figured he just wanted to make a name for himself by bringing a big-time murder case to trial. But the county prosecutor pointed to the continuing stories in the newspapers that were spreading wild rumors about a maniac roaming the streets of Columbus who wanted to hunt down more young women. So the prosecutor said this case needed to be closed soon before there was complete panic across the city. Detective Phillips agreed with that, but Phillips was convinced he wouldn't be able to close the case until he found this Janet person, the person he was sure was having an affair with Theora when she was killed. So Phillips and his team kept interviewing new people connected to Theora, and they circled back around to talk to people they had already met with to see if maybe they had missed something the first time they spoke. Then, just after 11 a.m. on June 18th, so 5 days after Theora's murder, police brought a woman in who they hoped could move the investigation forward. The young county prosecutor would lead the interview. He asked the woman a series of questions over the course of 4 hours. And when the woman was tired and worn down, she said something that made Phillips and the prosecutor rethink the entire investigation. What they heard in that interview would finally lead Phillips to his Janet, and the police would discover who had killed Theora. Based on the interview led by the county prosecutor of that woman, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened the night someone murdered Theora Hicks on June 13, 1929. On that day, at about 9 p.m. at night, Janet's blue coupe pulled into the parking lot near the Student Center on the Ohio State campus. Janet was wearing pants, a dress shirt, and a tie. Janet was nervous and kept glancing back and forth to make sure nobody was watching the car. Then Janet saw Theora walking towards the parking lot. Theora got into the car, gave Janet a kiss, and they sped away from the university. A few minutes later, Theora found herself staring out at fields and farmland as they headed to the shooting range outside of the city. Theora knew this drive well, but something felt a little different that night. She felt a little lightheaded and maybe a bit confused. Still, she was excited to be going back to the shooting range. She had avoided it ever since she got caught by the police there over a year earlier, but she figured with as dark as it was going to be that night, the police wouldn't find them. Janet eased off the gas and turned onto the road that led past the shooting range and parked in the field nearby. Theora looked over at Janet and smiled, but Janet just looked away. Theora's head started to feel even lighter than it had on the drive over, and her face was starting to feel flushed and hot. Then Janet turned to her and said something that made Theora very angry. Theora snapped a comment back, and then before long, the two were arguing. Theora was livid, and she shouted at Janet, and then Janet screamed even louder back, and before long, Theora just felt so lightheaded and so angry that she just wanted to get some air. So Theora grabbed the door handle, but before Theora could get out of the car, Janet leaned into the back seat, picked up a hammer, and smashed it into the back of Theora's head. Theora heard ringing in her ears, but she was still conscious, just totally stunned. The cramped car had not allowed Janet to really get a full swing before she hit Theora. Theora's head wavered back and forth, and she turned and just stared at Janet in stunned silence. And Janet simply raised the hammer again and began striking Theora over and over again in the face. Theora felt warm blood running over her eyes, her cheeks, and nose, but she managed somehow to open the car door, and she stumbled into the field outside. Janet flung the driver's side door open, rushed around the car, grabbed Theora by the arm, then Janet raised the hammer high and brought it down again on the back of Theora's head. Theora slumped forward onto the ground. Her arm hit the ground hard in front of her, and her watch actually broke. Janet just stood there, staring down at Theora as blood began to pool around her, and Theora was still moaning and gasping for air. Janet thought that sound was absolutely horrible, so Janet dropped the hammer, took out a pocket knife, crouched down, and slit Theora's throat. Theora would die in that field. Then Janet grabbed the hammer off the ground, ran to the car, tossed the hammer and knife into the passenger seat next to Theora's purse, and then Janet sped away from the field and back onto the main road. Early the next morning, Janet went to the secret love nest and almost completely cleaned it out. Then Janet drove the blue coupe to the Ohio State campus and got the car washed by the custodian who worked at the university's veterinary school, where Janet was a professor. Dr. James Snook, the Olympic gold medal winner and widely respected veterinarian, was Janet. He had murdered Theora. It would turn out that James and Theora had been having an affair for years, but they had gone to great lengths to keep it secret. And so after Theora had gotten caught fornicating with Marion at the gun range, it really frightened James that they might get caught having their affair, and so she and James worked even harder from that point on to completely cover their tracks. That's why Theora almost never talked about her personal life. That's why James and Theora had rented an apartment they could sneak into through the back door, and that was why in all of their correspondence, James used a fake name, Janet. Ultimately, Theora wanted James to leave his wife for her, and she would get jealous and angry when he spent time with his family. And so sometimes Theora would go out with Marion just to try to make James jealous. But Theora did always hope that she and James would somehow work out their problems and be happy together. And in the days leading up to the murder, James had said that he did not want them to rent that secret apartment anymore. So Theora thought that meant maybe James was finally going to tell her that he was leaving his wife and that they could bring their relationship out into the open. But James had absolutely no intention of doing that. He was not about to leave his wife. He just wanted to stop renting the apartment with Theora. And he worried that when he told Theora this, she would end up telling his wife everything about their affair. So James decided to kill Theora. It turned out James's gold medal in the Olympics was for pistol shooting. So he was very familiar with the shooting range outside the city, and he would still go and practice there sometimes. He thought the shooting range's reputation as a sort of lover's lane would provide him cover and make it look like the murder was the result of an argument between a young couple. On the night of the murder, James was a little bit hesitant, but when he told Theora he was going to be going away for a while with his family, Theora snapped and got really mad. And so James just reached back into the back seat, grabbed the hammer, and followed through with his plan. But James got caught because the woman who spoke to Detective Phillips and the county prosecutor at the police station was James's wife. The police had brought her in because they had begun to suspect that Theora was more to James than just someone who could help him with his book. And they wondered if maybe James's wife had killed Theora in a jealous rage. But after hours of being interviewed, James's wife revealed that James had left the house and been gone for a long time on the night of Theora's murder. And so police dug deeper into James's background, and they discovered that James had been taking amounts of money out of his bank account that matched the amounts in Theora's passbooks. They also learned that James had easy access to the powdered marijuana and the Spanish fly that Theora had ingested because, at the time, both of those substances were used in veterinary medicine. But it was never determined if James had drugged Theora or if she had taken the substances willingly. When Phillips and the county prosecutor brought James in to be questioned again, he would first admit to being Theora's secret lover, Janet, and then he would ultimately confess to murdering Theora. James was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. In February of 1930, so less than a year after James had killed Theora, he was executed in Ohio in the electric chair. If I told you to picture the Amazon rainforest in your head, you would likely picture a dense tropical wilderness full of amazing and exotic animals. And you'd be right, that is a good representation of the Amazon rainforest. But what a lot of people don't know is that the Amazon rainforest is also home to a massive city. It's called Manaus, and it sits right in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, right along the Amazon River. And it happens to be one of the most violent places in the entire world. All it takes in Manaus is simply walking down the wrong street or crossing the wrong person, and you can get shot or stabbed in broad daylight, and there's virtually nothing anyone can do to stop it. In 1989, a 31-year-old former police officer named Wallace Souza decided to make a TV show about what it was actually like to live in his hometown of Manaus. And unlike other crime shows in Brazil that often censored out the most graphic content they covered, Wallace decided he wasn't going to do that. He wanted to expose the harsh reality of life in Manaus, and he felt like the only way to do that was to show everything. And so that year, he launched this show, which he called Canal Libre, which translates roughly to free channel. And true to form, there was no filter on what went on the air. And so this show was shocking. Viewers were given a front row seat to freshly murdered victims that are lying out in the road and slumped over chairs in restaurants and behind steering wheels. And the cameraman would zoom in on their fatal injuries, and they would zoom in on the faces of these people that have just died. Every gratuitous detail, every blood spatter, every grieving family member of the victim who's crying out in pain, all of it was shown on this TV show. And then, in between these very dark and violent segments about gang killings and drug deals gone wrong, Canal Libre also had a much lighter side. They would bring on local artists to talk about what they're working on, to maybe try to sell some of their goods. The show would also focus on down-on-their-luck families that needed help raising some money, and so the show was designed to get people to donate. And then also, for really no reason at all, there was a segment on the show where this puppet character would get into a fight with a man selling bread. It was a totally bizarre and shocking spectacle, and the people of Manaus loved it. And then eventually, the people of Brazil loved it. I mean, this was an extremely popular show. Because Wallace was often on camera on Canal Libre, he became very famous and very recognizable. And so when he would walk around Manaus, people would see him and literally just start clapping and cheering for him. And as he and his show became more and more popular across South America, Wallace decided he didn't just want to report on crime, he wanted to fight crime. So, on air, Wallace began berating the government for not being able to protect its citizens, and he berated the police for not being able to catch the criminals. And then off the air, Wallace campaigned for and was elected to political office in Manaus, where he continued to push hard to reduce crime in the city. And so it wasn't long before Wallace went from just being a relatively well-known TV host to being one of the most beloved and influential and trustworthy people in all of Brazil. However, over the years, there was one strange thing about his show, Canal Libre, that people just couldn't wrap their heads around. This oddity was most obvious in a now famous episode of Canal Libre that aired sometime in the mid-2000s. This episode opens with a Canal Libre reporter making their way through a jungle, and there's a cameraman filming them from behind. And this reporter, they're very carefully walking through, kind of pushing branches out of the way and high-stepping over all the underbrush. And then at some point up ahead, you see there is a clearing, and there is a third person standing in this clearing, and they're clearly looking straight down at something on the ground that we can't see. But this third person is very occupied with whatever is on the ground. And so eventually, this reporter makes their way through the jungle into this clearing, and then as soon as the cameraman gets into the clearing as well, he looks down at what is on the ground. And what you see is what appears to be a log that has previously been lit on fire because it's still smoking and it's black and it's charred. But as the cameraman zooms in, you see there are hands on this log. So you realize it's not a log, it's a human being who's obviously deceased. And based on how badly charred they are and how much they're still smoking, you realize very quickly that this person must have been on fire very recently as probably just a couple of minutes ago. Like right before the camera got here, this person was on fire. And so as you're kind of seeing this shocking image, the reporter suddenly talks about this person like he knows all the details of them already. He says, this person, it's a man, and they were not shot to death. They were doused with gasoline and burned alive. But at this point, the police had not come out. They had not seen this dead person yet. And so it made no sense that the reporter would have all this information on hand because no one knows this stuff yet. And based on just looking at this person's body, it was too badly burned to be able to tell whether it was a man or whether they had been shot or not or whether gasoline was used. But when Wallace was questioned about where he and his reporters got their information from, he just said, look, we're a very popular show and people call us often before they call the police and they give us information about what's happening in the city. And we have a huge team. We watch the police headquarters. We listen to the police's radio. We watch the morgue. We have loads of informants all over the city. And so we just get our information really, really quickly. And this answer was enough until 2008. That year, in October, the police arrested a former Manaus police officer who just went by the name Moa, and they accused him of 9 murders. And so they throw him in jail. But Moa, despite the seriousness of the charges against him, seems totally unfazed. It was obvious he had some sort of powerful connection outside of prison, some person or some entity that he fully expected was going to, at any moment, swoop in and magically get him out of prison. But that didn't happen. Moa just continued to sit in jail, and at some point that began to sink in that he was kind of on his own, and so he began to talk. And the story he would tell would shock Brazil. Moa would admit to having killed some people, but he would tell police, look, I'm just the assassin. The person who hired me for these killings is Wallace Sousa. It would turn out Wallace Sousa started his show, Canal Livre, with the best of intentions. But when his show became massively popular and it in turn made him, Wallace, also massively popular and powerful, he became corrupt. And at some point, after his meteoric rise, he formed this very powerful drug cartel, and then in an effort to bolster his illegal dealings and to boost his show's ratings, he decided to start contracting hitmen like Moa to start taking out rival gang members in Manaus. And he would tell the hitman how he wanted them killed and where he wanted them killed and at what time. And then after the hitman agreed to do this, he, Wallace, would go tell his camera crews exactly where to go and at what time so that they would be arriving at the murder scene literally right as it was happening or right afterwards, allowing them the opportunity to get all the gory footage before anybody else. It would take the police a year to finally compile enough evidence to charge Wallace with murder, but they would do it in October of 2009, and eventually Wallace would turn himself in. However, he denied everything. And then before he went to trial, he would die of a heart attack in prison. And so we never actually got to learn the full extent of what exactly Wallace Sousa had done, how many people he had had assassinated, and how many of them were shown on his TV show. But we do know that at least 3 of his assassination victims were shown on his TV show, one of them being the person that was found out in the jungle. They really were a man. They really had not been shot. They had been burned alive with gasoline at Wallace's discretion. But in the end, the person who paid the highest price for the Canal Livre killings was Moa, the hitman who blew the whistle on what was going on with the show. On New Year's Day in 2017, a crime syndicate overran the prison where Moa was being held. Now, they had lots of targets of people they were going there to kill, and one of them was Moa. They were furious with him that he spoke to police and gave up information about the drug trade in Brazil. And so eventually, this angry mob of gangsters made their way over to Moa's cell, and when they found him, he was pressed up against the back of his cell wall, basically as far away from the bars as he possibly could be, and he began pleading for his life, and this horde was not having it. They were only there to kill him. And so they all have machetes and knives, and they're looking at him through the bars, and they say, we're going to come in there, we're going to cut you to pieces. And so then they start banging on the door, they're trying to hack the lock open, and Moa, he can't do anything. All he can do is kind of just keep himself all the way to the back of the cell and hope they don't get in. And eventually, they can't open the door, and they know it. And so they do the next best thing. They reach through the bars with a lighter, and they light Moa's mattress on fire. And so Moa was trapped. He had nowhere to go, and so eventually the fire reached him, and he burned alive. The next and final story of today's episode is called Inside a Nigerian Death Factory. In Nigeria, motorcycle taxi drivers are called Okadas, and in Ibadan, which is one of Nigeria's biggest cities, home to 3.5 million people, there are a lot of Okadas. However, despite their massive numbers, these Ibadan Okadas are actually a fairly tight-knit community made up primarily of young men. And so in early 2014, when 2 of these Okadas went missing, the community immediately found out about it and was really concerned. And when the police did not appear to be doing much to actually go out and find these 2 guys, the community of Okadas decided to launch a search of their own. Basically, as they went about their day, driving around the city, dropping fares off, all of these Okadas would be going down side streets and looking in back alleys and checking all over the city for their missing members. But despite their best efforts, they never could find them. Then, on March 22nd of that year, a 3rd Ibadan Okada vanished. He was a young man named Lanre Sadiku, and unlike the other two riders who went missing while they were at home, Lanre went missing while he was working. Lanre was part of a group of Okadas within the city who all kind of met up on the same city street, and that's where they stayed throughout the course of their day, trying to wave down fares as they came up. And so everyone in that meetup point all knew each other, and so they all knew Lanre. And on the day he went missing, they recalled seeing him driving away from this meetup point with two passengers on the back of his bike. Now, typically, the rides these Okadas would offer to their passengers were very short. They're only driving them just around the city. And so it was very quickly noticed that Lanre had left and after several hours had still not come back yet. When it was noticed by the other Okadas, they began talking about it and someone said, give him a call, make sure he's okay. And so they called his cell phone and Lanre did not pick up, which was highly unusual, not just for Lanre, but amongst the other Okadas. They always had their phones on because they're looking for new customers and customers could be calling them. And so their cell phone is a vital part of their work. And so his phone is off. They don't really know what to make of that. And then out of nowhere, Lanre actually calls this group of riders. However, he was calling them on his second cell phone. Lanre would keep a work phone and a personal phone. So he was calling them on his personal phone. And so when this other Okada answered the phone and heard Lanre's voice, he put the phone on speaker so the others who were concerned could hear what was going on. And what they heard was Lanre, totally hysterical, screaming into the phone that he needed help. He said that he and 8 other people he was with, who he didn't even know, had been kidnapped, and their kidnappers had brought them to this underground prison cell. They couldn't see anything, but they could hear people walking above them. Lanre also explained that when they had been kidnapped, the captors had taken all of their belongings, but they hadn't recognized that Lanre had this secondary cell phone, which is why he was calling from it. And so in between Lanre's frantic descriptions of what was going on and what had happened to him, these Okadas that received this call, they can hear in the background these other 8 people that are with Lanre in this underground cell screaming out as loud as they can, probably to get the attention of someone, anyone who was above ground who might be able to come down and save them. And so these Okada riders who are getting this call from Lanre, they're horrified and they're trying to calm Lanre down so he can explain where he is so they can go find him. And finally, Lanre, he does compose himself and he gives them really specific directions to this footpath that led into the Soka forest where he said he had been taken. The Soka forest was a very dense stretch of wilderness right on the outskirts of Ibadan. Lanre would tell them that he had no idea where specifically in the Soka forest he was. However, he said, if you just keep walking on that path, eventually you'll hear us calling out from underground and you can come and save us. And so as the riders turned on their bikes and they got ready to head out and go rescue their friend, they told Lanre to stay on the line. Let us keep talking to you until we find you. But as they're telling him that, his phone abruptly cuts out. And then when they tried calling him back, his phone was off. About 40 Okadas from Lanre's meetup spot took off together and sped down city streets until they hit this major highway that would take them out of the city. And then once they were out of the city, they went down this other road that brought them right towards the Soka forest. And then as this road put them right up against the tree line on their left side of the Soka forest, they all began looking for the 2 burned out cars that Lanre had said marked the beginning of this footpath they were looking for. And so sure enough, they find these burned out cars, they park all their bikes off on the shoulder of the road, and they quickly realize that this really is a footpath only. There's no way they can get their motorcycles onto the path, not only because the burned out cars are blocking their way, but because the path itself is so overgrown with vegetation. I mean, they can barely see the path, let alone drive something through it. And so the men leave their bikes by the side of the road, and then unarmed, they walk past the burned out cars onto this path, and then because it was so narrow, they had to walk more or less in a single file line into the Soka forest. And so as these men are basically marching into the woods, they're not making any sound, because again, they're trying to listen for the sound of their friend and the other people that have been taken captive somewhere underground. And so they're silently marching through this forest when all of a sudden, the guy at the front of the line thinks he hears something way up ahead. And so he holds his hand up to stop the line, and they all stop and they're trying to listen. And then all of a sudden, about 50 feet ahead of them through the trees, this man they didn't recognize suddenly jumped out from behind a tree. He yelled something at them, and then he raised his gun and began firing in their direction. The 40 Okadas immediately turn around and just sprint back down the path, right back out to the road. They hop on their bikes and they peel back out towards the city.
When they finally get back to the meetup spot they had all originated from, they realize they can't just leave Lanre and the other people he was with out to dry. They have to go back and rescue them. They considered calling the police, but given the lackluster response to the other two missing Okadas, they realized they probably would have a higher chance of saving their friend and the others if they just went themselves. And so the 40 Okadas rounded up another 60 from other neighboring meetup spots, and this huge posse of over 100 men all hopped on their bikes and headed back towards that footpath that led into the forest. When they got there, they put their bikes on the side of the road, and this time, when they started walking down that path, they had guns, knives, bats, all sorts of weapons, and they were not trying to be quiet. They were actually yelling like these loud war cries to let the gunmen and any other gunmen in the woods know that there was a horde of angry people that were coming into the woods for a fight. And so as they're marching down this trail, kind of expecting to get shot at any point, it doesn't happen. Instead, after quite a while, they walk out of the thick forest into this huge opening. And right in the middle of this huge clearing is this fairly small river, but it's big enough that it would be very difficult to cross. However, they can see there's a bridge, this kind of crumbling old stone bridge that goes over this river. And then on the other side of the bridge, on the other side of the river, they can see there are two dilapidated buildings. The one that is closer to the bridge is this small black shack that has a window looking out towards them. And from their perspective, they're maybe 100 feet away from the shack. They can't tell if anybody's inside of this building. And then the other building was much bigger than the shack. It was this huge kind of broken down warehouse that had big, tall cement walls. And then all around it was this huge chain link fence with barbed wire wrapped around the tops. And so this huge posse of Okadas, they come storming out of the forest and they run over to that bridge, which is the one way across. And as they get on the bridge, they're kind of scanning the two buildings. They're not seeing anybody. And then one of the men, they look down underneath the bridge and they actually see Lanre's motorcycle. It's lying on the banks of this river, kind of tucked up underneath the bridge, as if someone had stolen it. And so everyone already knows Lanre is somewhere over here. We're going to go find him. And so the men, they get over the bridge, they go to that first building, that black shack, and they open up the door. It's a plywood door, and there's no one inside. But the shack is literally stuffed full of hundreds and hundreds of articles of clothing and shoes. And so after kind of looking this over and not really sure what to make of it, the posse moved on from the black shack and made their way up to the fence right in front of this huge warehouse. And when they reach the fence, they're kind of expecting to be met with some sort of resistance. I mean, the last time they were out here, they got shot at. And so they begin yelling into the warehouse for anyone in there to show yourselves, come out here. But it was silent. And so one of the Okadas that was part of the posse had brought along bolt cutters as a weapon to use as a club if he needed to. But as it happened, he began to use the bolt cutters for their actual purpose, and he bent down and actually cut a huge hole in this fence so they could go in and explore this warehouse. And so after a large percentage of this posse had gotten inside the fence line, they began walking around this huge warehouse to try to find an entrance inside. And so as they're walking, the windows that lead into this warehouse, they're too high up, so you can't actually see what's going on inside. It's silent, there's a pretty bad smell, but they don't really know what to make of this. They walk around the structure, and when they get to the very back, they find an entrance. All it is this big rusted piece of tin metal, like sheet metal, that's propped up against a gap in the walls of the warehouse. And so one of the Okadas grabs this piece of metal and he pushes it out of the way. And then as soon as he did that, a few other Okadas quickly stepped through the threshold into the warehouse, preparing themselves to have to fight potentially if there are gunmen or anybody else inside that might want to do them harm. But as soon as they see what is inside of this warehouse, they immediately lower their weapons and just stare in abject horror. According to the locals who lived actually in the forest relatively near where this warehouse was, they said there was actually another way to get to this particular area, to get to the warehouse. There was another path that was very rough, but it was big enough for one vehicle that came in from the other direction. Now, the locals said they didn't use this path at all. They didn't even know where it originated from. But they said for the last 10 years or more, they have seen one vehicle use this road all the time to get to the warehouse. And it was this black Jeep with black tinted out windows. And they said it would typically show up most nights of the week around 8 p.m. And they said it would just go down the road, it would make its way over to the warehouse area, and then around 9:30 p.m., they would hear or see the black Jeep leaving. Now, none of the locals knew who was driving this Jeep. although they knew it was a man. That was really all they knew. And they had no idea what this man did when he got over near the warehouse. However, for the last 10 years, every time this guy was over near the warehouse from 8 to 9:30 at night, they would typically hear screams coming from that part of the woods, coming from the warehouse. And when the locals brought their concerns to police, the police just kind of blew it off and didn't do anything about it and actually told the people, don't worry about it. And so over the years, the locals had kind of just accepted that this man in his black Jeep and the screams coming from this warehouse were just a part of life. And so no one even reported it anymore. Had the police followed up on the locals' concerns about this Jeep and the screams, they would have discovered that that warehouse was actually a storage facility for a very in-demand and very illegal product. And that man who drove that black Jeep, he would take this illegal product and he would bring it back with him in batches and he would sell it on the black market. When this posse of 100+ Okadas pulled that metal door aside and they stepped into the warehouse, they were not met with any resistance. Anyone that had been there, any other gunmen or guards or anything like that, they had fled when they heard the sound of this massive posse whooping and yelling on their way in. And so as these Okadas are standing inside of the structure surveying what's in front of them, the first thing they noticed is right in the middle of the structure on the ground is this cement slab. It's about 4 feet by 4 feet, and one corner of this slab was elevated slightly by some rocks that had been placed under it, kind of propping it up, pitching it on an angle. And then just off of the side of the lowest point of the slab was this wooden bowl that had dark stains inside of it that was positioned in such a way that if you put water on the slab, the water would drain off of that corner directly into this bowl. Basically, it was there to catch any runoff from whatever was happening on this slab. Around this cement slab, all over the dirt floor, were bones, some with meat on them. And then beyond the bones and beyond the slab, all around the perimeter of the inside of this building were extremely malnourished, catatonic people chained up to the walls. These people were the highly in-demand, highly illegal product. More specifically, their body parts were the product. In Nigeria, a stunning number of people believe that certain magic potions and charms will grant you wealth and success, and in some cases, infinite life. But the catch is, the herbalists who will perform the magical rituals and give these potions and charms to people that pay for them, they often require human body parts for them to work. And so human body part factories, like this warehouse in Soka Forest, were established in order to meet the high demand of people that needed these parts. And so the way it's believed it worked at the Soka Forest warehouse was the man in the black Jeep. He would get orders from people that wanted specific body parts for their magical potions and charms and whatever else they needed. And he would make a list of those parts. And then at 8 p.m., he would show up at the warehouse and he would communicate with the people that worked at that warehouse. And they would determine out of all the captives they had, who had the parts they needed, and then after figuring out which captives were going to be used that night, they would go into the main section of the warehouse, and one by one, they would unchain these people, they would drag them to the center of the room, and in full view of all the other captives, they would put them on the slab, known as the slaughtering slab, and they would hack off the required body parts, and would bag them up, put them in coolers, and then the man with the black Jeep, he would take those parts and he would leave, and then the person who's just been butchered, if they were still alive and might have a chance of surviving, they'd just be brought back to the wall and chained up again. If they did not have a good chance of survival, then they'd be brought to the very back of the warehouse in the back rooms where they would be discarded. Now, the means of execution varied, but in the back rooms of this warehouse, they found a makeshift guillotine, which cuts off people's heads, and they also found a large crocodile that was chained up. And so it's likely that those were at least two of the methods used to discard of the people they could no longer harvest organs from. After the Okadas kind of broke out of their initial shock of what they were seeing inside of this warehouse, they went around and began freeing people that were still chained up to the walls. And in total, there were 23 people that were still barely alive, still inside of this warehouse, but none of them were Lanre Sadiku. And then after checking all of the dead bodies and body parts that were inside of the warehouse, and then also right outside, where there were a number of shallow mass graves, they couldn't find Lanre amongst them either. And so this huge posse began looking all over the property for an entrance to this underground prison that Lanre had described being in. But they couldn't find it, and so eventually this posse made their way back over to the survivors who were being tended to by locals that had come over, and they asked the survivors, are you aware of any underground prison cells somewhere around here where other people were being held? But the survivors either didn't know or just were unable to speak anymore. And so later that day, when the police did come out because word got out about this huge find out in this forest, the posse went to the police and begged them to please begin digging up this entire property. We need to find the entrance to this underground prison cell. Lanre and 8 others, and who knows how many others beyond them, are trapped underground in these cells, and we gotta get to them. But the police just kind of refused and immediately just demolished the warehouse. And then after kind of cordoning off that area for a couple of days, the police basically just left and stopped caring about it altogether. And so the Okadas once again came together as a community and would spend the next several weeks going back out to this forest and just manually began digging up all over this entire property in hopes of finding their friend and the rest of these people that were trapped underground. But they never did. And so we don't know what happened to Lanre and the other people who were trapped in that underground cell. We don't know what happened to the other 2 Okada riders who went missing right before Lanre did, although it's generally assumed they most likely were kidnapped as well and probably met a similar fate. We also have no idea how many people were butchered inside of the Soka Forest warehouse. However, given the massive amount of clothing and shoes inside of that black shack, it's believed the total number of victims is easily in the hundreds. No one has ever been officially held accountable for the atrocities that took place in the Soka Forest. However, a couple of days after the warehouse was discovered by the Okada posse, the posse was back digging, looking for Lanre, when they discovered there was this man who was there who was kind of walking around acting suspicious. And so the posse confronted him, and it would turn out this guy had several human tongues in his pockets, along with dozens and dozens of cell phone SIM cards. And so, assuming he was part of whatever happened there, the Okada posse proceeded to kill the man on sight. Later on, a woman who was a survivor from the warehouse would tell reporters how she got kidnapped. She said she lived in Ibadan, she was well educated, she had a good family, she was just sitting outside of her house when all of a sudden this van pulled up in front of her, and these very official looking men were inside of this van, and they got out and they told her, you're under arrest, you gotta come with us to the police station. And the woman was so confused, but the men were very professional and seemed very convincing, and so she got inside the van, they shut the door, and they drove off. And very quickly, once she was inside of the van and couldn't go anywhere, she realized they were not police, she had been kidnapped, and within the hour, she, along with several other people who had probably been kidnapped in the same way, were stripping their clothes off right outside of that black shack on the other side of the river, and they were told to put their clothes and belongings inside of the shack while they were being held at gunpoint, and then once they were naked, they were promptly marched into that warehouse where virtually everyone around her would be butchered and killed.
Here's the sentence rewritten in proper American English. Thank you for listening to the exclusive episode of the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and are looking for more thrilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. Simply search for MrBallen podcast episode wherever you get your podcasts, and you'll find them all. Additionally, there are hundreds of other stories like the ones you heard today, available in video format on our YouTube channel called MrBallen Podcast Episode. I truly appreciate your support. Until next time, take care.